This is the Queen Mother, a pastel coat, somewhere between mint and lavender. That matching hat with the upturned brim, a little gloved wave, the soft smile, the gin. Here was a woman who waved at racehorses, lived to 101, and seemed, by every account printed in every newspaper, to be the warmest soul in Britain, the nation's grandmother, the Queen Mum. That's the version they sold us, and they sold it well. So well that questioning it feels almost rude, like criticizing someone's actual gran. When she died in 2002, the queues to file past her coffin stretched for miles, and people stood through the night to take their turn. And nobody in that line spared a thought for overdrafts or appeasement or institutionalized nieces. They pictured a kind old lady who smiled her way through the 20th century and somehow outlasted it. But I've spent a while now reading the biographies, the authorized ones, the hostile ones, the diaries of people who sat at her dinner table, then walked home and wrote down what they really thought, and the woman who emerges is not the woman on the commemorative tea towel. She could be charming, and she could also be cold, unforgiving, financially reckless, and politically reactionary in ways that would send a modern PR team reaching for the brandy. Grudges she held for decades. Her household ran like a small Edwardian principality, deference flowing in one direction only. And by some distance, she outclassed every other image maker the British monarchy produced across the whole 20th century. Two things can be true at once. Britain loved her, and she earned a fair amount of that love through genuine courage. She also qualified, comfortably, as a piece of work. This isn't a takedown for the sake of it. Knocking a dead centenarian off a pedestal is hardly a fair fight, but the gap between the pastel myth and the documented woman is wide enough to be worth a long look. And the myth, as we'll see, came together by no accident. She built it herself, brick by pastel brick. So let me tell you about Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, not the smiling figure on the tea towel, but the harder woman underneath, the one with a welding machine where the marshmallow was meant to be. She kept that woman hidden. Almost none of what follows reached the public while she lived, and she made very sure it stayed that way. Every story about the Queen Mother eventually circles back to one wound, and that wound carries a name: the abdication. Strip away the hats and the horses and the gin, and you reach the event that shaped the rest of her life, and shaped the way she treated two particular people for the next 50 years. In December 1936, Edward VIII gave up the throne to marry Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee, and the crown landed on the head of his younger brother, Albert, known to his family as Bertie, and to history as George VI. Bertie never wanted it. He carried a stammer that turned public speaking into something close to torture, a nervous constitution, and no particular training for the role, because the throne, by every expectation, belonged to his elder brother and not to him. His wife, Elizabeth, watched the whole thing unfold and never forgave the two people she held responsible. She blamed Edward for his selfishness. She blamed Wallis for, in her reading of it, engineering the entire catastrophe. And when Bertie died in 1952 at the age of 56, worn down by a war nobody asked him to lead and a crown he never wanted to wear, Elizabeth's verdict hardened into something permanent. As far as Elizabeth saw it, Wallis Simpson killed her husband. You can understand the emotion. What's harder to defend is the half-century of cold administrative cruelty that followed it, the slow campaign Elizabeth ran against the Windsors long after the original injury had faded into history. Elizabeth became a driving force behind the social exile of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. The couple lived out their decades in France, summoned home only rarely, kept at arm's length from every family occasion that carried any weight. This never amounted to a hot rage that burned out. It functioned as a policy, maintained with bureaucratic patience across 40-odd years, a steady administrative pressure to keep two people on the wrong side of a door. And she supported, with full conviction, the decision to deny Wallace the style of Her Royal Highness. Now, this particular detail gets mangled a lot, so let's get it right. The popular telling puts Elizabeth personally decreeing that Wallace would never be an HRH, an act of pure spite dressed up as protocol. That's not quite what happened. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin and the government's legal advisors settled the legal question whether a woman who married a former king automatically acquired royal style, and they ruled that she did not. Elizabeth did not invent the ruling. What she did instead, enforce it rigidly for the rest of her life and resist every attempt to soften it. She never sat as the judge. She worked as the bailiff, and she never once showed mercy in the role. The Windsors, for their part, lost without a shred of grace. In their private correspondence, some of it later published, they mocked Elizabeth with a nickname that turned slightly notorious. They called her Cookie, a dig at her plump, biscuit-fond coziness, and on other occasions they downgraded her further to plain Mrs. Temple. Lovely people all round. There's a fringe theory worth mentioning only so we can throw it away. A handful of writers, Christopher Wilson among them, have suggested that jealousy really drove the loathing that Elizabeth herself once carried a torch for Edward, and that the whole decades-long freeze amounted to a spurned woman's revenge. It's a tidy bit of psychodrama. Not one scrap of archival evidence sits behind it, and you should file it where it belongs, in the bin marked things that would suit a good film and a bad history book. The real story needs no romance subplot. A woman watched her husband shoulder a job that helped to kill him, decided where the blame lay, and then spent the next 50 years ensuring the people she blamed never once forgot her verdict. No crush drove that. Elizabeth nursed something far more durable instead, a grudge with the stamina of an Olympic athlete, and she trained for it daily. Before the war turned her into a hero, Elizabeth and her husband took a political decision that the heroism later buried. It deserves digging back up. The smiling wartime queen had, only months earlier, thrown her full weight behind one of the most criticized foreign policies in British history. Through the late 1930s, as Hitler's Germany rearmed and annexed and threatened, the British government under Neville Chamberlain pursued the policy known as Appeasement Giving Ground, signing agreements, hoping that a reasonable concession here and there would keep the peace. Elizabeth and George VI did not merely tolerate this policy. They actively, enthusiastically backed it and backed the man behind it. In September 1938, Chamberlain came back from Munich, waving his famous piece of paper and his promise of peace for our time. The king and queen reacted with a gesture that still leaves constitutional historians wincing. They invited him onto the balcony of Buckingham Palace, placed him between them, and let him soak up the roar of the relieved crowds as though the whole policy were a shared family triumph. That sounds like a small thing, and it counted for far more. The monarch is meant to float above party politics, neutral, untouchable, the referee who never picks a side. Putting a sitting prime minister on the royal balcony at the height of a fierce national argument about a fiercely contested policy amounted to the crown planting a flag. It told the country, without a single word, which side the palace stood on. Constitutional historians have never quite known where to look when they discuss it. The episode remains one of the clearest breaches of monarchical neutrality in modern British history, and Elizabeth stood right there, waving, fully on board. To be fair to her, and we should be fair, Once the war actually came, her resolve turned total. The talk of accommodation stopped dead. When officials suggested the royal children be evacuated to Canada for safety, she produced the line that became legend. The children would not leave without her. She would not leave without the king. And the king would never leave. She stayed in London through the Blitz. After a German bomb struck Buckingham Palace itself, she delivered another line destined for the history books, claiming she felt almost glad of it because now she could look the bombed-out East End in the face. Hitler reportedly called her the most dangerous woman in Europe, which, if he ever uttered the phrase, ranks as about the finest review a person could hope to receive. So the wartime courage is real, and I'm not here to strip it from her. But courage in 1940 does not erase judgment in 1938. And the woman who refused to flinch under the bombs cheered on 2 years earlier. The very policy that left Britain so dangerously unready for them. Both facts belong in the file, and we don't keep only the flattering one. Her politics did not soften with age either. We have to tread carefully here, because the evidence shifts from public record to private testimony. The picture of Elizabeth as deeply reactionary, suspicious of immigration, mournful about the loss of empire, frosty toward the post-war Labour government and its welfare state, comes mostly from the diaries of insiders who knew her well. Kenneth Rose, the royal chronicler. The politician Woodrow Wyatt, who adored her and recorded her table talk in detail. These are not court documents. They are single-source memories of unrecorded conversations, written down by men with their own agendas, and they should be read as exactly that. Reported private remarks, not official positions. With that caveat firmly nailed down, the diaries are consistent, and they are consistent with something quite simple. Elizabeth arrived in 1900, a daughter of the high aristocracy, and carried the worldview of that class and that era essentially intact for the next 101 years. The opinions attributed to her hold nothing eccentric. They amount to the ordinary furniture of an Edwardian patrician mind that never felt much need to redecorate. That renders them less shocking and, arguably, sadder. She never qualified as a monster. She amounted to a fossil, beautifully preserved and still smiling in lavender. For a woman who became a symbol of national thrift during the war, make do and mend, dig for victory, all of that, Elizabeth approached money in a way that can only be called Edwardian, which is a polite way of putting it. She spent as though the 20th century, with its taxes and its hard new sense that money came from somewhere, had simply never arrived. Clarence House, her London home, ran on a scale that belonged to a vanished world. A large staff of pages, footmen, dressers, and chefs moved through its rooms. A string of racehorses ate their expensive way through her accounts because she loved steeplechasing above almost anything and chased it with the focus other people save for a whole career. Flowers, entertaining, fine wine, the works. She did not budget. The concept appears to have struck her as something that happened to other, smaller people. The result surprised nobody. She consistently spent beyond her income, and she ran up an overdraft with the royal bankers, Coutts & Co., that grew into something genuinely eye-watering. The press has long settled on a figure. Somewhere between 4 and 7 million pounds. You'll see 7 million quoted most often, usually with a tone of gleeful astonishment. I have to raise a hand here and slow things down, because that number, repeated so often it now passes for fact, rests on nothing anyone has ever confirmed. Coutts does not discuss its clients. Buckingham Palace has never verified the sum. The 4 to 7 million figure amounts to a media estimate, an educated guess that hardened into received wisdom through sheer repetition. What sits solidly established is the shape of the thing, not its precise size. She carried a very large overdraft year after year, and she showed not the faintest interest in ever reducing it. Somebody, naturally, covered it, and that somebody turned out to be her daughter. Queen Elizabeth II quietly subsidized her mother's lifestyle from her own private fortune, topping up the gap between what the Queen Mother received and what the Queen Mother spent, a gap that yawned a little wider every year. I should be precise on one point that often turns muddled. No public taxpayer money cleared her debts when she died. The family settled the bill, whatever its true size, out of family wealth. Still, sit with the picture for a moment. A nation taught itself, partly through her own wartime example, that sacrifice and restraint counted as noble things. And the woman who came to embody that lesson ran, in private, a personal economy built entirely on the assumption that the money would simply appear. It usually did. There lay the privilege. Not the racehorses, not the gin, not the regiment of staff. The deeper privilege lay in never once having to wonder whether the overdraft might become a problem. For her, it never did. Her daughter saw to that. Now we come to the part of the story where the jokes stop. There is nothing funny anywhere in what follows, and the only honest way through it runs plainly and slowly, with the wry voice switched off. Elizabeth's brother John fathered two daughters, Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon, the Queen Mother's nieces. Both girls came into the world with severe intellectual disabilities. In 1941, by then young women, the family committed both sisters to the Royal Earlswood Hospital in Surrey, an institution for people with learning disabilities, and there they vanished from the family record. How completely they vanished is the detail that still carries the power to shock. The 1963 edition of Burke's Peerage, the great genealogical directory of the British aristocracy, listed both Nerissa and Catherine as dead. Both sisters lived Nerissa until 1986, Catherine until 2014. For decades, the official printed record of their own family declared them deceased while they lived on, in a hospital, a short drive from relatives who never came to visit. It is worth being careful about who did what here. Storytellers have pushed the cover up into lurid shapes it does not quite deserve. Authorized defenders, meanwhile, have excused it in ways it deserves even less, and the honest account sits somewhere in the cold middle ground between them. Fenella Bowes-Lyon, the sisters' own mother, submitted the falsified entry to Burke's Peerage. Archival evidence confirms it. She filled out the forms, she returned them, the false information came from her hand. There is no documentary evidence whatsoever that the royal family ordered her to do it. No memo, no instruction, nothing pointing to a palace conspiracy to scrub two disabled women from the bloodline. Something almost worse in its ordinariness operated instead, a plain social norm. Among the early 20th century upper classes, hiding disabled relatives counted simply as what one did. Quietly institutionalize them, quietly stop mentioning them, let the world assume. It counted as standard practice, and standard practice is sometimes just cruelty that everyone has agreed not to notice. Where Elizabeth herself sits in, this is the genuinely contested question. The official palace narrative, supported by her authorized biographers, holds that the Queen Mother knew nothing, that no word of her niece's survival or their institutionalization reached her until 1982, when a newspaper broke the story, and the public learned the truth at the same moment she supposedly did. Independent historians and journalists have examined the claim and found it very hard to swallow, and their argument against the official line runs straight. These two women hardly counted as distant cousins 3 times removed. Nerissa and Catherine belonged to Elizabeth's immediate family, the daughters of her own brother, her nieces by blood. Picture a woman as sharp, as socially meticulous, and as interested in family as Elizabeth simply losing track of 2 close relatives for 40 years. The idea strains belief well past its breaking point. She forgot nothing else, and she recalled slights from the 1930s with perfect clarity into the 1990s. The selective amnesia, applied so neatly to the one branch of the family that caused embarrassment, is the part the skeptics cannot move past. I can't prove she knew. Nobody can, not on the evidence available. But the official story asks us to accept that the most retentive memory in the royal family carried one strange, total blank spot, and that the blank spot happened to fall exactly where the embarrassment lived. Make of that what you will. What isn't in any doubt is the human cost, and nobody should hurry past it. Two women lived almost their entire lives inside an institution, while their family, one of the grandest in the land, treated their existence as a clerical error. Whatever Elizabeth did or didn't know, that is the fact sitting at the center of it. Nerissa died in 1986, and the grave that held her bore, for a time, nothing but a serial number and a small plastic tag. The granddaughter of an earl, remembered by a serial number. The jokes can start again after this section. Not during it. Some chapters of a life shut the door on irony, and a forgotten grave marked with a number is one of them. Right, back to the woman herself, and to a description of her so sharp and so durable that it has outlived almost everyone who could have verified whether it was ever actually said. Somebody once described her as a marshmallow made on a welding machine, soft on the outside, structural steel underneath. That line is usually credited to the photographer Cecil Beaton, and it fits her so perfectly that I'd treat the attribution with a raised eyebrow. Witty society quips drift, over time, toward whichever famous wit happened to stand nearest, and Beaton may well have coined this one, or he may not have. The phrase has long outgrown its source anyway. An honest label reads, widely attributed to Cecil Beaton, and the one confident thing worth saying is that whoever did coin it measured her exactly. Behind the pastel softness, Elizabeth ran her household like an autocrat, governing a very small, very elegant state. Her staff did not advise her. They obeyed her. Nobody requested deference. Because it already hung in the air, the house breathed, the assumed condition of standing in any room with her. She expected family and servants alike to bend around her preferences, her schedule, and her moods, and they generally did, because the alternative turned unpleasant fast, and because she kept a famously long memory for anyone who failed the test. And then there is the drink. No single subject about her has generated more cheerful mythology, and almost none of that mythology survives contact with the people who actually knew her. The popular image is of a queen mother permanently and merrily sozzled gin before lunch, Dubonnet alongside it, a glass of something through the long afternoon, port to round the evening off. The list goes on. Tabloids have, at times, pushed it further still, into the territory of the stumbling alcoholic, the grand old lady barely upright by tea-time. That version is exaggerated, and the people best placed to know have stated so plainly. Her former equerry, Colin Burgess, who worked closely with her, has described a household where alcohol flowed freely and threaded through the ordinary daily rhythm, and where Elizabeth herself carried a tolerance that bordered on a professional skill. She drank, and she drank generously, and the tolerance behind it earned its legend, what never matched reality. The picture of a woman impaired by any of it. By every credible account, she carried out her public duties, the engagements, the speeches, the endless smiling and waving with total precision, year after year, decade after decade. She liked to drink, and several more after it, and she never once let it show where it mattered, which tells you, in its own quiet way, more about her than the gin ever did. The drinking, the autocracy, the iron grip on the household, none of it ever cracked the surface she permitted the public to see. She kept two faces, the soft one and the steel one, and she hid the join between them for the better part of a century. No vague, gin-fuddled grandmother pulls that off. It takes discipline of an almost frightening order. Marshmallow on top, welding machine all the way down. The Queen Mother's final decades brought her into open conflict with the one royal capable of out-charming her on a public stage, a younger woman who understood the modern camera at least as well as she did. Her name was Diana, Princess of Wales. The standard account is simple and dramatic. A cold and unwelcoming royal establishment froze out. Diana, the warm and wounded outsider, and the Queen Mother, that establishment's grand matriarch, ran the deep freeze personally. It's a satisfying story. Like most satisfying stories about this family, someone has tidied it well past the point of accuracy. Start with what is solid. Elizabeth genuinely, deeply disapproved of Diana's later conduct, specifically of Diana carrying the family's private griefs into public view. The 1995 Panorama interview, in which Diana spoke candidly to the BBC about her marriage, her husband's affair, and her own struggles, appalled the Queen Mother. To Elizabeth, the monarchy survived on mystique. The institution worked precisely because the public did not see the machinery, the unhappiness, the ordinary human mess behind the palace walls. Diana pointed a camera straight at that machinery, and for that, in Elizabeth's eyes, she committed something close to treason against the family business. So the disapproval ran real, and so did the chill. What the tidy version leaves out is that the chill blew in both directions, and Diana played no passive victim slowly frozen by a unified, hostile clan. By her later years, she actively cut off royal relatives and household staff she no longer trusted, withdrawing and drawing her own hard lines around whom she would still see. Both sides built that estrangement. Casting Elizabeth as the sole architect of a Windsor freeze produces a clean villain, and clean villains usually signal that somebody has stopped looking closely, none of which warms the portrait. Elizabeth stayed cold toward Diana. She picked the institution over the individual every single time, and Diana, by then, counted as an inconvenience to the institution. But she ran a ruthless freeze out of her own, and she formed one half of a mutual, miserable estrangement, described different charges, and the evidence supports only the second. The Queen Mother dealt hard with Diana, but she never worked that thermostat alone. If you carry one thing away from all of this, carry this. The cuddly Queen Mother you think you remember came together as a deliberate creation, an image as carefully designed and maintained as any modern political brand. And Elizabeth built that creation herself, piece by piece, over decades. This is the part where genuine admiration creeps back in. Whatever else we hold against her, Elizabeth practiced strategy at a level almost nobody around her could match. She grasped something about modern monarchy that most of her relatives never did, and she grasped it early. The crown, she understood, could not survive on mystery and ermine alone, not in an age of newspapers giving way to newsreels, giving way to the unblinking intimacy of television. It needed a face, and it needed warmth. And above all, it needed love rather than mere obedience. So she built a face. The pastel coats came as a deliberate choice, soft colors, never threatening, easy to pick out in a crowd, endlessly photographable. Those hats with the lifted brim came as a choice too, shaped so that cameras and crowds could always find her eyes. The smile, the wave, the unhurried walkabout, the apparent delight in every bunch of flowers handed up by every child, all of it polished, all of it consistent, all of it pointing at one idea. Here is your grandmother, the message ran. Here is something warm and safe and unchanging, so trust her and trust the family standing behind her. It worked completely. The performance worked so well that it became, for most of the public, the entire person, the costume mistaken for the body underneath. And the cleverest part? The warm grandmother act guarded no vacuum at all, but its own exact opposite. Under the lavender sat a conservative, unbending, autocratic matriarch with firm opinions and a 50-year memory for her enemies. And the public adored a woman they never, in any honest sense, actually saw. The modern monarchy still runs on her blueprint. The carefully managed image, the warmth deployed as armor, the understanding that being loved is far safer than being feared, that design is Elizabeth's, and the institution has never stopped using it. She didn't merely play the game, she wrote the rule book the players are still reading from. So, after all that, did the Queen Mother amount to a fraud? It is the obvious question to land on, and it is also the wrong one, because the honest answer refuses to sit on either side of the line. No, and that is the inconvenient, untidy answer that a proper look at her keeps insisting on. She qualified as neither a fraud nor a saint. And the temptation to pick one label and walk away is exactly the temptation worth resisting. The courage held. A woman did stay in London under the bombs when every excuse and every means to leave lay open to her, and that mattered enormously to people who could not leave at all. Her charm held too, and so did the iron discipline behind it. The century of flawless public performance never once fumbled. And the strategic mind held. The monarchy she helped redesign still standing today, partly because of it, and the rest held just as firmly. There was the 50-year grudge against a sister-in-law, pursued with a coldness that never once thawed. There was the cheerful, balcony-waving endorsement of Appeasement, conveniently mislaid the moment it turned embarrassing. Money spent as though arithmetic concerned only other people. Reactionary politics carried unexamined from 1900 to 2002, like a piece of family furniture too heavy and too familiar to shift. And, hardest of all, two disabled nieces and the long silence around them that the official story has never managed to explain away. To borrow the line one last time, a marshmallow made on a welding machine. The real trick of her: she kept a whole nation staring at the marshmallow for 70 years, and never once let it think to ask about the machine. We tend to want our historical figures sorted into the correct drawer hero here, villain there, lid closed, job done. Elizabeth Bowes Lyon does not fit in a drawer. She ran brave and cold at once, generous and unforgiving, beloved and barely known, and every part of it held true together, inside the same small, smiling, immovable woman. The tea towel shows you one of her, the soft one, the one easy to love. A second woman always stood behind it, harder and colder and far less comfortable to look at, and she is the one the cheering crowds in 2002 never actually met.